The first sound Elijah heard each morning was the rattle of chains and the low growl of the overseer's hounds. Dawn had not yet broken when a heavy fist slammed against the rough wood of the slave quarters. "Up, up, you black dogs," bellowed Overseer Pike. His voice was sharp as the crack of a whip. Most dreaded the whip would follow if they hesitated. Elijah forced his body upright from the pallet of straw that had been his bed. His back ached from yesterday's work, and the scars crisscrossing his shoulders burned with the memory of the lash. He was 22, but his body bore the wear of a man twice that age. Around him, the others stirred in silence. Mama Ruth, bent and gray-haired, whispered a prayer under her breath as she helped the youngest boy, Josiah, to his feet. Silence was survival. Even the children had learned it. The quarters smelled of sweat, dirt, and despair. One small cabin stuffed with too many bodies. Rats scurried in corners, feasting on crumbs of cornbread left from the night before. They had eaten little, a handful of corn mush, maybe a strip of salted pork if luck favored them. Elijah's stomach growled, but hunger had long since become part of him, as constant as the air he breathed. Outside, the first gray light stretched across the tobacco fields. The rows seemed endless, stretching all the way to the tree line where freedom began and ended. Elijah had once tried to run as a boy, thinking he could outpace the hounds. He had not forgotten the day Pike dragged him back, bleeding and half-dead, and nailed him by the ear to the whipping post until he fainted. Since then, he worked, he obeyed, he endured. But inside, something still lived, something that Pike's whip had not killed. "Move." Pike snarled, stepping into the cabin. His boots were caked with mud, his whip dangling lazily from one hand. He carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed he owned the sun itself. His eyes scanned the slaves like livestock, choosing who looked strong enough to bear the hardest burdens. Elijah met his gaze only for a second, then looked down. To look too long was to invite punishment. But even that small flicker of defiance earned him a blow across the shoulder. "You'll break before the day's done." Pike sneered. Elijah said nothing. Silence was his shield. The slaves filed out into the fields, their breath clouding in the cool air. Men, women, children, all bent to the endless task of tending the tobacco. The soil clung to their bare feet. Their hands were raw, blistered, and swollen. The overseers circled like wolves, whips ready to cut flesh at the first sign of slowing. As the sun rose higher, the heat pressed down like a weight. Sweat stung Elijah's eyes, his muscles screaming as he worked the rows. Every pull of the hoe was agony, but to pause meant pain far worse. He glanced at Mama Ruth a few rows away, her bent body still moving with stubborn rhythm. She had lost 3 sons to the auction block, but her spirit had not yet broken. She often whispered to Elijah, "The Lord see us, child," even when they don't. At midday, slaves were given their ration, a ladle of thin corn mush, eaten standing in the fields under Pike's watchful eye. Elijah swallowed it quickly, more to quiet his hunger than to nourish his body. Across the field, a young girl dropped her bowl from exhaustion. Pike descended on her like a hawk, striking her with the whip until her screams echoed through the rows. No one moved to help her. No one dared. By evening, when the sky burned red with sunset, Elijah's body trembled with fatigue. His hands bled from blisters, and his back was a map of scars, both old and new. When Pike finally barked the order to stop, the slaves trudged back to the quarters in silence. Each step heavy with sorrow. Inside the cabin, Mama Ruth tended to the wounded girl, whispering hymns as she dabbed blood with a rag. Josiah curled up beside Elijah, whispering, "One day we gone, be free." Elijah didn't answer. He stared at the dirt floor, his jaw tight. The dream of freedom was dangerous, yet it lingered in every heart. For Elijah, it was the only thing that kept his soul alive. Outside, the master's mansion gleamed on the hill, its windows glowing with candlelight. Laughter and music drifted through the night, the sounds of a world that thrived on the suffering of those below. Elijah closed his eyes and prayed for strength. Tomorrow would bring the same chains, the same whip, the same endless fields. But deep within, beneath the scars and the silence, something burned. Something the master could not gamble, The overseer could not break, and the whip could not kill. The fire of a man who refused to surrender. Asterisk by the time the fields lay silent. The big house on the hill stirred to life. Servants rushed to and fro, polishing silver, filling decanters with whiskey and preparing the grand parlor for the evening's gathering. Tonight, Master Henry Callahan would host his favorite pastime, poker. Henry Callahan was a man of contradictions. In the daylight, he strutted through the fields, boasting of his wealth, his land, and the fine stock of slaves that kept his plantation alive. But when night fell, his wealth became cards on a table, his pride a mask that often crumbled under the weight of loss. His clothes were immaculate, a waistcoat of deep blue velvet, gold buttons glinting, boots polished until they shone. Yet beneath the silk and the swagger, debt gnawed at his bones like a rat in the dark. Elijah knew this well. As one of Callahan's chosen house slaves, he moved silently among the masters when they gathered, carrying whiskey trays, lighting cigars, and pouring drinks while pretending he could not hear the words that passed between them. That night, the parlor was thick with cigar smoke. Laughter and curses mingled as men shuffled cards and slammed down coins. The air stank of sweat, tobacco, and the sharp bite of whiskey. Elijah moved between them with careful precision, balancing the crystal glasses so they did not spill. "Another round," barked Judge Wilkes. A man with a belly like a barrel and cheeks flushed red from drink. Elijah bowed his head, filled his glass, and retreated into the corner. He knew the rules. Never look a white man in the eye, never speak unless spoken to, never show that you heard what you heard. But he heard everything. The men spoke of debts, of land trades, of horses and crops. But soon, the conversation turned darker. Callahan sneered one of the planters. "Word is, you've been losing more than you can afford." "That true?" Henry stiffened, then laughed. "A gentleman always has more to wager, sir." "Always." The cards were dealt again, hands slapping the table. Elijah's sharp eyes caught the tremor in his master's fingers, the way his lips pressed tight. He had seen this before, Henry's pride dragging him into deeper waters than he could swim. The pot grew larger. Silver coins clinked together. Watches and rings were tossed onto the pile. The men leaned forward, sweat beading on their brows. Henry lost once, twice, and again. His smile grew thinner, his voice sharper. Then came the hand that would change everything. Henry leaned back in his chair, his eyes glittering with desperation. "Gentlemen," he drawled, "I've one more wager to place. Something of great value." The room hushed. Elijah froze, balancing his tray. "My daughter," Henry said, almost casually. Clara, a few of the men laughed, thinking it a jest. But Henry did not smile. "You mad, Callahan?" one asked. "She's your blood." Henry shrugged, his face tight. "She's worth more than coin, and I've faith in my hand." The laughter died. Judge Wilkes leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You serious?" "I am." The cards hit the table. The game played out in silence, the air so thick with tension, Elijah could barely breathe. Henry's hand shook as he laid down his cards, a confident smirk spreading across his face. Then the planter across from him revealed his hand. A flush. Higher. Stronger. Henry's smirk collapsed. The room erupted. Laughter, curses, slaps on the back. "Well, Callahan," sneered Judge Wilkes, "seems your pride cost you more than you can pay." Henry slammed his fist on the table. "No, it ain't binding. She's my daughter." But the rules of the game were sacred among men like these. A wager was a vow. A man who broke it was no gentleman at all. Clara. Callahan had just been lost in a game of cards. Elijah stood frozen in the corner, his blood turning cold. He had seen slaves gambled before, men, women, even children. But never a white girl, never the daughter of the master. The irony burned in his chest like fire. Henry staggered to his feet, his face red with fury and drink. "Deal again," he demanded. But the men only laughed, gathering their winnings. His debts were sealed. His honor shattered. The night ended with Henry storming from the parlor, whiskey bottle in hand. The others followed, leaving their smoke and laughter behind. Elijah remained to clean the glasses, his hands steady, though his heart raced. He thought of Clara, the girl who drifted through the big house like a ghost. Untouched by the filth of the fields, living in silks while he lived in rags. She would never look at him, never know his name. And yet, now she belonged to the same world he did. A world of chains. A world where flesh was currency. As Elijah scrubbed the last glass, he whispered to himself, the devil done won his game tonight. Clara Callahan had lived her entire 17 years in comfort. The daughter of a wealthy Virginia planter, she wore muslin dresses trimmed in lace, her hair pinned neatly by house servants, her shoes polished daily. She had never set foot in the slave quarters, nor lifted a hoe in the fields. To her, slavery was a shadow that kept her father's world running unseen, spoken, accepted. But on the morning after the poker game, Clara's world cracked. She awoke to shouting in the parlor. Her father's voice thundered with rage, the sound of glass shattering following close behind. Clara rushed down the staircase, her slippers silent against the polished wood. She found Henry Callahan, her father, pacing like a caged beast, whiskey bottle clutched in one hand. "Father," she whispered. He turned, his face flushed and eyes bloodshot. For a moment, Clara recoiled. He looked like a stranger. "Go back upstairs," he growled. "Why are the men here? Why are they shouting silence?" His voice cracked through the room like a whip. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. Her father had raised his voice before, but never like this. That afternoon, the truth reached her like a knife. Judge Wilkes himself arrived at the house, his carriage rolling up the drive. He entered with the air of a man come to collect what was his. Henry met him in the hall, his voice lowered but heated. "You will not take her," he hissed. "A wager's a wager," Wilkes replied coolly. "She belongs to the table now. You know the rules, Callahan? If you break them, you lose more than honor. You lose everything." Clara, listening from the stairs, felt her blood run cold. Belongs. The word echoed in her head. Later, her father confessed through gritted teeth. "I made a bet," he muttered, eyes avoiding hers, "and I lost." Clara's lips parted in disbelief. You gambled me?" Henry slammed his fist on the table. "Don't speak to me like that. You are mine to do with as I please." His words hung heavy, crueler than any lash. That night, servants stripped Clara of her silks and laces. The fine muslin dresses were locked away. Instead, she was given a coarse cotton shift, the same fabric the field hands wore. The shoes she had prized were taken. She stood barefoot on the wooden floor, humiliated, trembling. Overseer Pike was the first to smirk at her fall. He watched as she carried buckets of water from the well, her soft hands blistering within hours. "Looks good on you, girl," he sneered. "About time you earned your keep." For the first time in her life, Clara felt the sting of the whip. It lashed across her back when she faltered in the field, her screams swallowed by the endless rows of tobacco. The slaves around her did not look up. They could not afford to. That night in the quarters, she sat apart, sobbing quietly. The slaves kept their distance, suspicious of this white girl forced among them. To them, she was not a sister in suffering, but the daughter of the man who had owned them. Only Elijah looked at her with something more than suspicion. He had seen the moment of her humiliation, had watched her shoulders bend under the same whip that had carved his back for years. He knew what it meant. She had crossed the line between privilege and bondage. Clara caught his gaze once, her eyes red-rimmed. "Why are they doing this to me?" she whispered. Elijah's voice was low, steady. "Because now you one of us." She turned away, sobbing harder. Days turned into weeks. Clara's hands hardened, her skin burned dark beneath the sun. Hunger gnawed at her belly. Her body grew weak from labor. She learned to rise before dawn, to keep her eyes down, to endure Pike's lash. But humiliation burned deeper than pain. Once the daughter of a master, now she was nothing more than property. A wager lost in a smoky room. Elijah watched her struggle, torn between anger and pity. Anger, because she had lived blind to their suffering until it touched her own skin. Pity, because he knew what lay ahead. Once the whip kissed your back, you were never free again. Not in body. Not in spirit. Clara Callahan had fallen. The earth of Virginia swallowed her whole. Asterisk, the plantation air grew heavier with every passing week. Summer pressed down with its merciless heat, turning the fields into ovens where men, women, and now Clara labored from dawn to dusk. Overseer Pike thrived in this season, his whip forever in hand, his cruel grin eager for the sound of flesh breaking. Clara's fall from privilege had become a spectacle. Pike treated her no differently than the slaves. In fact, worse. He seemed to take delight in stripping her of dignity, reminding her daily that she was no longer the master's daughter, but another body to command. Carry that faster. "Girl!" he barked one morning, as Clara staggered under the weight of a water bucket. Her face was red from heat, her arms trembling. When she stumbled, spilling water into the dirt, Pike's whip lashed across her back. She cried out, dropping to her knees. The other slaves kept their heads down. To look, to show sympathy, was to risk punishment. Only Elijah dared to glance up. His fists clenched as he watched Pike strike again. Something twisted inside him, not satisfaction, not pity, but a cruel knot of both. For years, Elijah had dreamed of the masters tasting their own whip, their own hunger. Yet watching Clara bleed, he found no joy, only bitterness. When dusk fell, the slaves returned to their quarters, bodies broken from the day's work. Clara trailed behind, her shift torn and stained with dirt and blood. The slaves avoided her, whispering only among themselves. She was a symbol now, proof that even whiteness could be dragged into the pit when the master's scenes grew too large. Inside the cabin, Ruth tended to wounds as she always did. She dabbed Elijah's back with cool water where Pike's lash had struck him for pausing too long at midday. Then she turned to Clara. "Come here, child," she murmured, her voice both stern and soft. Clara hesitated. Her pride still clung to her, even in rags. But the sting on her back left no room for pride. She sank to her knees before Mama Ruth, who pressed a rag to her wounds. "You'll live," Ruth said, "but you best learn fast. The lash don't care what color your skin is once you on this side of the line." Clara lowered her head, tears dripping onto the dirt floor. For the first time, she listened, truly listened, to the voices around her. She heard Josiah whispering about hunger, heard the quiet moans of a woman who had been whipped raw that morning, heard Elijah's steady breathing as he fought against pain in silence. That night, as the slaves drifted into uneasy sleep, Elijah sat awake, staring at the roof beams. Clara's soft sobs reached his ears. Against his better judgment, he spoke. "Crying don't stop the lash." Her breath caught. "Then what does?" "Nothing," Elijah replied after a pause. "Only endurance." The words fell heavy. For Clara, they were unbearable. The idea that pain was not a punishment to be avoided, but a daily fact of life. For Elijah, they were the truth he had carried since childhood. The next day, Pike's cruelty sharpened. Perhaps he sensed rebellion in the air, or perhaps he simply enjoyed breaking spirits. He forced Elijah to carry stones across the field until his legs buckled. When Elijah fell, Pike struck him again and again, until blood soaked the dirt. Clara, watching from a few rows away, bit her lip until it bled. She wanted to scream to stop it, but fear choked her. That night she did something no one expected. She brought Elijah a cup of water, stolen from the kitchen. Her hands shook as she held it out. "Drink," she whispered. Elijah looked at her, suspicion in his eyes. But thirst overcame pride. He drank, water spilling down his chin. "Why?" he asked hoarsely. Clara's voice cracked. "Because I can't stand it. I can't stand watching them do this to you." Elijah studied her for a long moment, then turned away. "Now you see, this is every day. This is every breath." Clara did not answer. But in that silence, something shifted. The barrier between them, built by race, by blood, by chains, began to crack. Still, Overseer Pike loomed like a shadow. He saw everything, smelled weakness, like a hound. and he hated nothing more than the thought of slave and white girl finding common ground. For Pike, cruelty was not just a tool, it was power, and he would not let that power slip, not while the fields still needed blood to water them. The plantation burned with suffering, and Pike's whip wrote its gospel on every back. For Elijah, each lash was a reminder. For Clara, each lash was a lesson. And together, they learned that pain was the language of Virginia's soil, etched in whips and ashes. Soil, etched in whips and ashes. The auction block was where hope went to die. Every few weeks, word spread through the quarters like a sickness. The master was selling again. It meant families torn apart, children screaming, husbands and wives shackled to strangers. For Henry Callahan, the sales were nothing more than arithmetic debts against flesh, silver bought with lives. Elijah had been through it many times. He had watched his brother sold south at 12 years old, his mother begging until Pike whipped her silent. He had seen men examined like horses, their teeth pried open, their backs slapped to test their strength. He had seen babies ripped from their mother's arms, their cries drowned out by the auctioneer's booming voice. Each time, Elijah survived, but a piece of his soul withered. This time, Clara saw it too. The journey into town was a spectacle. Callahan rode in his carriage, fine hat pulled low, while Elijah walked, shackled behind the wagon that carried the slaves for sale. Clara was forced to march with them, her cotton shift no different from the rest. Her bare feet bled on the stones, her face pale with terror. The townsfolk stared, murmuring, pointing. Some laughed at the sight of a planter's daughter in rags. At the auction yard, the scene was chaos. The smell of sweat, tobacco, and horse manure mixed in the humid air. Men with purses full of coin jostled for a view. The platform loomed, a wooden stage where lives were priced and traded. One by one, the slaves were dragged up. The auctioneer shouted their age, their worth, their breeding value. Bidders raised hands. Coins clinked, whips cracked when anyone resisted. A young mother clutched her little boy to her chest. When the auctioneer pried the child from her arms, her scream pierced the air. Clara flinched, her own eyes filling with tears. She had known of auctions every plantation child did, but knowing was not the same as witnessing. Elijah stood beside her, wrists bound, jaw clenched. He did not look at her, but he felt her trembling. This was her education written in screams. When Elijah's turn came, the crowd stirred. He was strong, tall, with muscles hardened by years in the fields. The auctioneer praised his back, his arms, his ability to work. Bids rose quickly, but before the gavel could fall, Henry Callahan shouted, "Not him." His voice carried desperation. "That one stays." The crowd murmured, displeased. Elijah was too valuable to keep when debts were so deep. But Henry would not part with him. He needed Elijah's strength in the fields, and perhaps, though he would never admit it, his pride would not allow the man who had watched his downfall to be sold away. Others were not spared. Children were pulled from their mothers, old men dragged away in chains, women examined like cattle. Clara watched until she could no longer breathe. Each sale tore at her insides, unraveling what little faith she still held in the world she once knew. When it was over, the wagon rolled back to the plantation, half empty. The quarters that night echoed with silence, punctuated only by quiet sobs. Empty beds, empty hearts. Clara sat in the shadows, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She whispered, "It's wrong. All of it. How can they?" Elijah turned his head slowly, his eyes dark. "Now you see?" His voice was flat, carrying no triumph, no pity, just truth. She looked at him, desperate. "But you, how do you endure it?" Elijah stared at the floor. "Ain't no choice. You endure, or you die." The words struck her like a lash. She had always believed choice was the right of all people. Now she learned, for the enslaved choice had been stolen generations ago. That night, she dreamed of the mother's scream, of the little boy's face disappearing into the crowd. She woke with her heart pounding, sweat on her brow. In the darkness of the cabin, she heard the others praying, whispering, mourning. The auction had stolen more than people. It had stolen what little hope the quarters still held. For Elijah, it was a reminder of the price of flesh. For Clara, it was the shattering of every illusion she had ever known. And for Henry Callahan, it was only another debt briefly paid, while the true debt, the one written in blood and chains, grew heavier by the day. The air on the plantation grew heavier with every passing day. The auction had left wounds too deep to hide. Mothers wandered aimlessly, their arms empty. Fathers sat by the fire with dead eyes. Songs, once whispered at night to soothe children, had fallen silent. Elijah felt it in his bones. Something was breaking. Whispers began in the fields. Men talked low while chopping cane. Women exchanged glances when the overseers' backs were turned. The auction had stolen too much. Hope had been stripped bare, leaving only rage. The overseer Pike sensed it too. His whip lashed harder, his boots stomped louder. He cursed more freely, beat for smaller infractions. He wanted fear to snuff out the embers before they grew into flames. But each strike only fanned the fire. One night, in the quarters, Elijah heard the first true talk of rebellion. Josiah, an older slave who had lost his son to the auction, whispered, "We can't live like this no more. Either we rise or we rot." The others hushed him quickly, glancing to the shadows where spies might linger. But Elijah saw in their eyes the same thought. Death had become less frightening than chains. Clara, sleeping on a straw mat in the corner, overheard enough to understand. She said nothing, but her stomach churned. She had once thought her suffering unbearable. Now she realized she was living among people who carried mountains of pain and still stood tall. Days later, spark caught. It began when Pike beat a boy barely 12 for stumbling with a sack of cotton. The whip tore his back until the child collapsed, blood staining the dirt. Something inside Elijah snapped. He stepped forward, his hand gripping Pike's wrist mid-swing. For a breathless second, the entire field froze. Pike's face turned purple with fury. "You dare?" Elijah's voice was low, steady. Enough. The field erupted. Men dropped their sacks, women rushed forward, children cried out. Josiah lunged at Pike, striking him across the jaw with a hoe. Another man grabbed the whip and flung it aside. Chaos thundered across the fields. Overseers shouted, shots rang out, but the slaves surged like a tide. Years of pain boiled over in fists, shouts, and desperate strikes. Clara, watching from the shadows, felt her heart race with terror and awe. For the first time, she saw them not as broken, but as powerful. The rebellion lasted only minutes before gunfire silenced it. Callahan rode in with armed men from neighboring plantations. Muskets cracked, bodies fell. Josiah was shot through the chest, collapsing in Elijah's arms. Women screamed, dragging children to cover. Blood turned the cotton rose red. Elijah fought like a man possessed, swinging a hoe with the strength of fury itself. But for every overseer he struck, 2 more closed in. A musket but slammed into his skull, dropping him to his knees. When the smoke cleared, the rebellion lay in ruins. The survivors were shackled, their bodies battered, their spirits raw. Callahan's face was twisted with rage and fear. His debts had grown, his authority had crumbled, and now his slaves had dared to rise against him. That night, punishment rained down. The rebels were tied to posts, whipped, until flesh peeled from bone. Pike, bruised and bloodied, carried out the lashings with sadistic glee. One by one, men and women collapsed, some unconscious, some dead. Elijah's turn came last. Callahan ordered 50 lashes. By the 20th, his back was a ruin of blood. By the 30th, Clara could no longer watch. She turned her face away, tears streaming, but Elijah endured. Each lash tore at his flesh, but he refused to scream. He would not give Callahan that victory. His silence became defiance, a final act of power. When the whipping ended, he fell to the dirt, barely breathing. Clara rushed forward despite the overseer's shouts. She pressed her hands to his wounds, whispering, "Hold on. Please, hold on." In that moment, the lines between master's daughter and slave vanished. She was simply a girl kneeling beside a man who had borne the weight of chains too long. The rebellion had failed. The price was blood and broken bodies. Yet something lingered in the ashes, a truth that could not be whipped away. For the first time, the plantation had trembled, and though silence fell again, it was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of waiting for the next spark. The rebellion left the plantation in ruins. Not in its buildings or crops, though those bore scars, but in its soul. The quarters, once filled with murmurs of song and whispers of prayer, now echoed with groans of the wounded. Empty beds told of those who had not survived. Children cried through the night, calling for parents who would never return. Henry Callahan's whip could break flesh, but it could not stitch back the fabric of his world in Richmond and beyond. Word of the uprising spread quickly. Other planters whispered behind their fans at taverns and parlors. Callahan lost control of his stock. He's weak, careless. In the brutal economy of Virginia's 1840s, reputation was as valuable as land. And Henry's was rotting. Worse still were his debts. The poker table that had stolen his daughter's freedom was only one of many. He owed merchants in town, lenders in Richmond, even fellow planters. The failed rebellion made buyers hesitant to extend credit. His cotton fetches at market dropped, buyers citing risk of trouble. Desperation gnawed at him. He turned harsher, crueler, as if violence could patch the holes in his crumbling empire. Overseer Pike followed suit, his lash striking harder, his punishments more inventive. Slaves were tied in stress positions, denied food for days. His body, still raw from 50 lashes, was pushed back into labor almost immediately. Every step in the fields was agony, every movement reopening wounds that refused to heal. Yet he endured, jaw clenched, eyes hard. He would not break, though each day left him closer to death. Clara watched all of it with growing horror. Once she had lived in ignorance, sheltered by her father's wealth. Now she saw the cost of that wealth in every scar, every sob, every chain. She no longer dreamed of escape. She dreamed of survival, for herself and for those she had come to see not as slaves, but as people. One night, she crept to the quarters with stolen bandages and salve. She knelt by Elijah, pressing cloth to his wounds. "You can't go on like this," she whispered. His eyes opened, dull with pain but still burning. "I've gone on my whole life like this, but why?" she asked. "Why not? Let go. Because if I give in, they win," he rasped. "Every breath I take is defiance." His words struck her deeper than any sermon she had ever heard. She realized then, strength was not in the whip, nor in the ledger, nor in the false dignity of planters. Strength was in survival, in refusing to bow even when chained. Meanwhile, Henry's world cracked further. Creditors arrived at his door demanding payment. His poker companions mocked him in whispers, refusing to lend another dime. Even Pike began questioning his authority, muttering about finding a stronger man to serve. In his desperation, Henry considered selling Clara outright. She was, after all, part of his property now, thanks to the bet. He could fetch a high price in New Orleans. Where wealthy men sought exotic comforts, the thought made him sick, but not sick enough to dismiss it. Clara overheard him one evening, drunkenly muttering about it to Pike. Her blood froze. She realized she was no safer than those she pitied. Her father had gambled her away once he could sell her again, and this time she might not live to tell it. The plantation itself seemed to sense its master's unraveling. Crops withered from neglect. Tools broke and went unrepaired. The slaves worked slower, not from rebellion, but from despair. Each day felt like a step toward collapse. And then came the fire. No one ever knew who started it. Perhaps a candle knocked over, perhaps a spark caught by wind, perhaps a deliberate act of vengeance. But one humid night, flames licked the walls of a cotton barn. Within minutes, the building was an inferno. Henry staggered into the yard, screaming orders, but the slaves did not move to obey. They stood in silence, watching the fire consume what had consumed them for so long. Pike tried to rally them with his whip, but even he could not fight the blaze. The fire raged until dawn, leaving behind only ash and twisted beams. Half the season's crop was gone, and with it, Henry's last chance to repay his debts. For Elijah, the flames were a vision, the chains of the plantation, glowing red, cracking, breaking. For Clara, they were a warning. Her father's world was ending, and she was bound to it. For Henry Callahan, they were the final toll of a debt he could never repay, not in coin, not in blood, not in all the flesh he had ever bought and sold. Asterisk, the fire marked the beginning of the end, by dawn. Smoke still drifted from the blackened husk of the cotton barn. The smell clung to everything, clothes, skin, even the soil. The enslaved stood in silence, their faces lit by the pale morning light. Some mourned the destruction. Others felt a grim satisfaction. The master's wealth had turned to ash, just as their families had. Henry Callahan staggered among the ruins, his fine clothes smeared with soot. His voice cracked as he shouted orders. No one obeyed. His overseer Pike snarled threats, whips snapping at the air, but the sound no longer carried weight. The slave's eyes did not lower. They stared back, hollow, unafraid. The fire had burned more than cotton. It had burned fear. Days later, creditors arrived from Richmond, their wagons heavy with ledgers and rifles. They came not as merchants, but as vultures. They demanded repayment Henry could not give. When he begged for time, they laughed. When he offered his slaves as collateral, they reminded him that word of rebellion had spread no one would pay full price for. Tainted stock, the men left him humiliated, promising to return with lawyers and chains. The plantation sank into chaos. Food stores dwindled. Tools rusted. The fields grew wild. Pike grew restless, lashing out with random violence, beating men and women for imagined offenses. But each blow only widened the cracks. One evening, as thunder rolled on the horizon, Clara found her father at his desk, bottle in hand, papers scattered. His eyes were wild, bloodshot. "They're taking it all," he muttered. "Everything. The land, the house, even you." His hand shook as he poured another drink. "I bet my pride. I bet my bloodline. And I lost," she whispered, trembling. "Then let me go. Let them go. Don't drag us all down with you." But Henry's pride was a wound that would never heal. He slammed his fist against the desk. "Never. If I fall, we all fall." That night, Pike cornered Clara in the yard. His breath stank of whiskey, his eyes glinting. "When the master's gone, girl, I'll be the one in charge. Best you learn your place early." His hand clamped her wrist. Before he could drag her closer, Elijah appeared from the shadows. His voice was quiet but deadly. "Let her go," Pike sneered. "You think you scare me, boy?" But Elijah did not back down. His silence was sharper than any blade. Clara yanked free and ran. That confrontation lit the fuse. The next morning, Pike was found dead in the stables, his skull cracked open. No one spoke of how it happened. No one mourned. His body was dumped in a shallow grave behind the barn. Henry erupted in fury. He stormed into the quarters with a pistol, threatening to shoot the first man who spoke out of turn. But his threats rang hollow. The pistol shook in his hand. His slaves no longer cowered. They stood in silence, waiting. That night lightning split the sky. Rain poured down in sheets, drumming against the roofs, turning the yard into mud. Clara lay awake, heart pounding, sensing something was coming. She was right. A group of slaves, gaunt and scarred, but burning with quiet fire, gathered at the edge of the quarters. They carried hoes, axes, stones, whatever could be turned into weapons. Elijah stood among them, his face grim. "This ends tonight," he said. His voice was low, but it carried. "No more chains. No more whips." Clara stepped forward. "If you fight, he'll kill you all." Elijah's gaze met hers. "He already has." The storm raged as the rebels surged toward the big house. Doors splintered, windows shattered. Henry fired his pistol blindly, screaming curses, but the mob closed in. Years of torment poured out in fists and fury. Clara fled into the rain, her dress clinging to her skin. Behind her, The house that had once been her home became a battlefield. Thunder drowned out the shouts, but she could not block the images. Her father dragged from his study, his screams swallowed by the storm. By dawn, the mansion was nothing but rubble and smoke. The Callahan estate was finished, debts unpaid, master slain, overseer buried in dirt, but victory brought no joy. The survivors gathered in the ruined yard, soaked and exhausted. They were free, yes, but freedom in 1847 Virginia was no gift. Patrols would come. Militias would march. Retaliation would be swift and merciless. Elijah stood tall, bloodied but unbroken. He looked to Clara, who stood apart, trembling, drenched in tears and rain. They shared no words, only the knowledge that both had lost everything. And yet something new had been born in the ashes. That night, as torches flickered in the distance and hounds barked on the wind, the plantation fell silent for the last time. The world would call it a rebellion. They would call it a tragedy. They would call it proof that slaves were dangerous, ungrateful, savage. But for those who had endured, it was something else. It was justice. Carved out in blood, and though Virginia would bury the truth beneath laws, chains, and fear, the soil remembered. Every field, every road, every ruined barn whispered of the night when one man's gamble, betting his daughter against a slave lit the fire that destroyed his world. Daughter against a slave lit the fire that destroyed his world.